They handed me a pen and told me to sign away everything my father ever built. My hands were shaking. My eyes were full of tears. And every single person in that room was smiling, because they thought they had finally broken me. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that in exactly 11 seconds, the same signature they demanded from a broken, ignorant girl would become the blade that cut all of their throats at once. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you, if you have ever smiled through humiliation while planning your own quiet war, then stay with me, because this story is for you. My name is Elena Duarte, and for 2 years I let an entire family believe I was stupid. I let them laugh at me in front of guests. I let them hand me newspapers I could read perfectly and watched their smug little smiles when I pretended the letters meant nothing. I let them starve my pride, one dinner at a time, one insult at a time, until I was nothing but a shadow wearing my father's last name. And I would do it all again, every single humiliating second of it, because that silence, that unbearable silence, was the only weapon my father ever gave me. This is the story of how I lost everything, and how I took it all back. It started on a warm evening in late autumn, in a private hospital room in the hills above the city, a room that smelled of lavender disinfectant and something else underneath it, something quieter, something that smelled like an ending. My father, Mateo Duarte, lay in that bed, a man who had once filled entire rooms with his presence, now reduced to a fragile shape beneath white sheets. Mateo Duarte was not just my father. He was the founder of Duarte Vineyards, a name that meant something across 3 countries, a name built from nothing but red soil, aching hands, and a stubbornness that refused to die even when everyone told him he would fail. My real mother had died when I was 9 years old, a slow illness that stole her a little more every month until there was nothing left to hold on to but memory. 2 years later, my father remarried a woman named Renata, a woman with a voice like warm honey and a smile that never once reached her eyes. I remember the first time I met her, how she knelt down to my height and told me she would love me like her own daughter. I believed her because I was 11, and because grief makes you want to believe in anything gentle. Renata brought a son from her first marriage, Diego, 3 years older than me, quiet and watchful even as a boy. I used to think wicked stepmothers only existed in old fairy tales my mother used to read me. I was wrong. I simply hadn't met one yet. On that last afternoon of his life, my father asked everyone to leave the room. Renata protested loudly, her voice thick with performed anguish, insisting she deserved to stay by her husband's side. Diego stood near the door, his eyes red, whether from real grief or rehearsed grief I still don't know to this day. But my father was firm, firmer than I had seen him in weeks, and he said only one sentence that silenced the room completely. I want to say goodbye to my daughter alone. When the door finally clicked shut, the silence in that room felt enormous, sacred almost, like the whole world was holding its breath. My father reached for my hand with a strength I didn't know he still had left inside him. His skin was cold, papery, the veins beneath it a fragile blue map of everything his body had already surrendered. "Elena," he whispered, and his voice cracked like dry leaves underfoot. "Come closer. I don't have much time, and I need you to listen to me carefully." I leaned in until my forehead nearly touched his. "Papa, please, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." He smiled, a small, sad, knowing smile. "We both know that isn't true anymore. So let's not waste these minutes on comfortable lies. I need you to promise me something, and I need you to promise it with your whole heart, because a lot depends on it." "Anything," I said, and I meant it, though I had no idea what that promise would eventually cost me. "From today," he said slowly, choosing each word like it was made of glass, "you are going to become someone else. A woman who knows nothing about wine. Nothing about numbers. Nothing about this business I built with my own hands. You are going to forget everything I taught you, everything I trained you for since you were 16 years old. You will let them believe you are weak. You will let them believe you are foolish. Do you understand what I'm asking of you?" I didn't understand, not really, not then. Panic rose in my throat like bile.
Papá, why?
Why would you ask me to hide everything you gave me?
I don't understand.
His grip on my hand tightened, urgent now, desperate almost. Renata has been placing her own people inside this company for 6 years, Elena. Quietly, patiently. She thinks I don't notice, but I notice everything. I built this empire by watching what other men missed. I see the way she smiles at board members. I see the way Diego's name keeps appearing in places it has no business appearing. I don't have the strength left to fight her the way I used to. But you do.
You have my mind, Elena, and you have something I never had at your age. Patience.
Tears blurred my vision until his face became a soft, aching outline. What do I do? You wait, he said. A lion doesn't attack in the open field where everyone can see it coming. It hides in the grass. It waits and waits and waits until its enemy stops watching, until its enemy grows careless with victory. That is when it strikes. Promise me you will wait, Elena. Promise me you will be patient, even when it feels impossible.
Especially when it feels impossible.
I promised through tears I couldn't stop, my voice barely a whisper, my whole body trembling with a grief I hadn't even fully arrived at yet.
3 hours later, in the deep quiet of that same room, with only the soft beeping of machines as witness, my father was gone.
The funeral was a performance dressed up as mourning. Renata wore black lace and cried beautifully, dramatically, dabbing at eyes that never seemed to actually produce a single tear I could verify. Relatives I barely knew embraced me, whispered condolences that felt hollow the moment they left their lips. I stood at the edge of my father's grave and felt, for the first time, truly and completely alone. A week after we buried him, Renata gathered the family in the main living room and announced, with a grief-stricken face that didn't match the calculation in her eyes, what she called my father's final wish. She said that before he died, he expressed a desire that I marry Diego, so that the family fortune would remain protected, so that the business would stay, as she put it, in loving hands. I felt something cold settle in my stomach the moment the words left her mouth. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a lie. My father would never have thrown his own daughter into a cage disguised as a marriage. But I was grieving, isolated, and surrounded by people wearing my father's photograph on the wall behind them while plotting against everything he loved. So I remembered my promise. I remembered the lion waiting in the grass. And I said yes. The wedding, when it came, was cold and joyless, a business transaction disguised in white lace and forced smiles for photographs neither Diego nor I actually wanted taken. Standing at that altar, I looked into Diego's eyes and searched for even a flicker of protest, some sign that he, too, felt trapped by his mother's ambition. I found nothing but quiet, practiced obedience. That was the day my silent war truly began, though nobody in that church, dressed in their finest clothes, clapping politely, had any idea a war had started at all. I had studied international business and viticulture in France, at a program that accepted only a handful of students each year. I graduated at the very top of my class. I had interned with negociant houses in Bordeaux, learning to read a balance sheet the way other people read novels, learning to negotiate delicate contracts fluently in 3 languages. My father had trained me since I was 16, quietly, patiently, driving me himself to weekend conferences, letting me sit just behind his shoulder during tense board calls, teaching me to notice the small tells in a man's voice when he was lying about numbers. All of that carefully built knowledge, all those years of quiet discipline, I now had to bury completely, like something shameful, something to be hidden rather than celebrated. Renata tested me almost immediately, and she tested me in front of an audience, because humiliation performed publicly wounds far deeper than humiliation delivered in private. At my very first family dinner as her official daughter-in-law, with nearly 20 relatives gathered around a table glittering with crystal and candlelight, she handed me a folder with a satisfied little smile stretched across her lips like a blade. "Elena, dear," she said sweetly, her voice pitched perfectly for the whole table to hear, I imagine growing up so far from the city, all this business talk must feel quite overwhelming for you. Why don't you look over tomorrow's shipping schedule for us? Just so everyone can see how well you're settling into your new family. The entire table went quiet, forks suspended mid-air, eyes turning toward me with open curiosity. I looked down at the paper in my hands. I could read every single line as easily as breathing, faster even, because I had reviewed 100 schedules exactly like it during my internships. I made my hands tremble, ever so slightly. I let my brow furrow as though the words in front of me had rearranged themselves into some foreign, unreadable script. I don't really understand numbers like this, Mama, I said, letting my voice shake with practiced uncertainty. Someone near the far end of the table smothered a laugh behind a napkin. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, into my cheeks. Diego, my husband of exactly 1 week, stared down at his plate and said absolutely nothing to defend me, his silence louder than any insult could have been. Renata sighed with a sympathy so false it curdled in my stomach. Poor thing, she said, patting my hand as though comforting a child. It's all right. Eat your dinner. We'll teach you, little by little, won't we, Diego? Every syllable was a small blade sliding quietly between my ribs. I smiled, lowered my eyes, and swallowed my rage along with my wine, telling myself over and over that this was only the beginning, that I only needed to survive tonight, and then tomorrow night, and then the night after that. The humiliations became a ritual after that first dinner, a slow, deliberate campaign designed to convince the entire family, the entire staff, the entire world, that I was exactly what she wanted me to be. She sent me to negotiate with local suppliers using invoices she had deliberately made confusing, then mocked me openly in front of the household staff when I failed to calculate the totals correctly. She handed me foreign export contracts written partly in English and French, languages I had studied for years, and asked me to translate specific clauses, watching my face closely for any flicker of comprehension I might accidentally let slip. One evening, during a dinner with a visiting investor from Chile, a distinguished older man with kind eyes and an easy laugh, he turned to me pleasantly and asked if I spoke French, since he'd heard through Renata that I had studied abroad. Before I could even form an answer, Renata let out a loud, dismissive laugh that echoed across the dining room. Oh, she barely finished school back home. French. Can you imagine? She patted my knee under the table, hard enough that I felt the sting through my dress. She's wonderful in the kitchen, though. Aren't you, dear? I felt the blood rush to my face, humiliation burning through me like fire through dry grass. But I bowed my head, forced a small, embarrassed giggle, as though she had simply told the truth about a woman incapable of anything more complicated than boiling water. Diego said nothing again, his eyes fixed on his wine glass as though it held answers to questions he refused to ask out loud. His silence, I was beginning to understand, was its own particular kind of cruelty, quieter than his mother's open contempt, but every bit as sharp, every bit as devastating. At night, alone in a bedroom inside a mansion full of people who despised me, I cried until my pillow was damp and my throat ached from suppressing sound. I would lie awake in the darkness and ask myself, over and over, why my father had done this to me, why he had asked me to endure a slow, grinding humiliation instead of simply telling me the truth from the beginning. But every single time the tears finally dried, I remembered his eyes in that hospital room, that fierce, desperate love beneath the fear, and I understood, somewhere deep beneath the pain, that there was a reason buried in all of this, a reason I hadn't uncovered yet. I simply had to survive long enough to find it. That reason found me on an ordinary Tuesday evening, 6 months into my marriage, when the house had gone quiet and I was walking past Renata's private office on my way to bed. Her door was slightly ajar, a thin blade of golden light spilling into the dark hallway, and her voice drifted out, low, but unmistakably triumphant, the voice of a woman who believed she had already won. Don't worry, it's completely under control, she was saying into the phone, a small, satisfied laugh threaded through her words. The girl is an idiot. She'll do whatever we put in front of her. She always does. Prepare the transfer documents exactly as we discussed. All we need is her signature, or her fingerprint if she claims she still can't write properly, which honestly wouldn't surprise me at this point. The timing has to be soon, before that old lawyer decides to come back from wherever he's been hiding and complicates things for us. I stood frozen in that hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I was certain she would hear it through the door. Transfer documents. Fingerprint. The old lawyer. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. I understood, in that single frozen moment, that Renata was preparing to strip me of absolutely everything my father had left me, using my own carefully constructed performance of ignorance as her legal cover, her alibi, her weapon. I backed away from that door as quietly as I had come, my hands shaking, my mind racing. From that night forward, I stopped being a frightened girl waiting passively for mercy that would never arrive. I became something else entirely. A hunter, waiting patiently in the grass for the exact right moment to close the trap around her. I needed two things immediately: proof of exactly what was written inside that document, and someone inside the house I could actually trust. I found her in Consuelo, the housekeeper who had served my father faithfully since long before I was even born, a quiet, weathered woman with kind, tired eyes that had watched this family's slow decay for years without ever having the power to stop it. Consuelo was the only person in that entire mansion who still slipped me a warm cup of tea after a particularly cruel dinner, without ever once being asked, without ever once expecting thanks. One quiet afternoon, when Renata and Diego were both out at a business luncheon I had conveniently not been invited to, I found Consuelo folding linens in the small laundry room and took her weathered, work-worn hands in mine. "Consuelo," I said softly, my voice trembling with something between fear and desperate hope, "I need your help with something dangerous. I'll understand completely if you say no. I need to get into Señora Renata's office, just for a few minutes. I believe she's planning something terrible against me, something that could destroy everything my father left behind." Consuelo's hands went perfectly still beneath mine. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, fear and something else warring behind her eyes. "Señorita, if she discovers this, we will both be in very serious trouble. You understand that, yes?" "I understand," I said, holding her gaze steadily. "But if I do nothing, I lose everything my father built with his own two hands, and I believe she means to hurt me far worse than that." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle fully between us. "You served my father for 30 years, Consuelo. You knew what kind of man he truly was, beneath all the titles and the business suits. I don't believe, not for one single second, that he would want this life for me." At the mention of my father, something in her weathered face softened completely, decades of memory and loyalty flickering behind her eyes. She nodded slowly, deliberately, as though sealing a promise made long ago and only now finally being honored. "For Don Mateo," she said quietly, "I will help you." The following afternoon, at exactly 4 o'clock, when Renata took her daily tea on the terrace among her prized orchids, a ritual she never broke regardless of the weather or her mood, Consuelo staged a small, believable accident, spilling a full glass of water in the hallway directly outside the office door, rushing inside for a cloth with practiced urgency, and in that same fluid motion, slipping the spare office key silently into my waiting palm. "5 minutes, señorita," she whispered as she passed me in the hallway, her eyes darting nervously toward the terrace. No more than 5 minutes. My hands shook so badly it took me 2 attempts to turn the key correctly in the lock. Inside, the office smelled faintly of Renata's expensive perfume and something colder underneath it, ambition, perhaps, or greed given a physical scent. On the desk sat her polished leather briefcase, exactly where I had hoped it would be. I opened it with trembling fingers and found, buried beneath a stack of unrelated papers, a thick, professionally bound document. My stomach dropped violently as I read the title printed across the cover in stark black letters: "Voluntary Renunciation of Inheritance Rights and Irrevocable Power of Attorney." I forced myself to read further, my eyes racing across dense legal language that stated, in cold, clinical terms, that I, Elena Duarte, due to my documented lack of capacity and business competence, voluntarily surrendered all rights to my father's estate and shares in Duarte Vineyards, granting permanent, irrevocable control to Renata and Diego. At the very bottom of the final page, in smaller print I nearly missed entirely, sat a single devastating clause. In the event the signer is unable to write, a fingerprint may be substituted in place of a formal signature. They had planned for my illiteracy from the very beginning. They had built their entire trap around the exact lie I had been feeding them for 6 months. With shaking hands, I photographed every single page of that document, checking twice, 3 times, to make sure each image was clear enough to read later. Then I returned everything exactly as I had found it, closed the briefcase with careful precision, locked the office door behind me, and returned the key to Consuelo's waiting hand in the hallway, my heart still pounding violently against my ribs. I had the evidence I needed. Now, I needed a plan sharp enough to turn that evidence into a weapon capable of destroying them. There was only one person alive who could help me transform stolen photographs into justice. Andres Ferro, my father's oldest and most trusted friend, his personal lawyer for over 20 years, the man Renata had conveniently arranged to send on an extended business trip abroad, the very week my father died, a suspiciously convenient absence I now understood far too clearly. I hadn't heard a single word from him in 6 months, and I strongly suspected my phone was no longer a safe place to speak freely. I asked Consuelo for one final, crucial favor. I pressed a small folded piece of paper into her palm with a phone number written carefully in my own handwriting. "Please," I whispered, "find a way to call this number the next time you're out running errands for the household. Just say, 'Elena needs to speak with you urgently.' Then hang up immediately. Say absolutely nothing else, no matter what he asks." 2 days later, Consuelo returned from the market carrying more than groceries in her worn canvas bags. As she passed me in the corridor, she gave the smallest, most careful nod imaginable, a gesture so subtle no one else in the house would have noticed it at all. The message had gone through. 3 agonizing days after that, she pressed an old, battered mobile phone into my hands during a quiet moment in the garden, a single number saved carefully inside its contacts. "He called back," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the house. "He wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the Old Bookshop Cafe on Roble Street. He said it's urgent, señorita. Very urgent." Getting out of that mansion unnoticed became its own small, terrifying war. I woke early the next morning and faked stomach pain convincing enough, doubling over at breakfast with a groan that made even Renata's eyes widen slightly with something resembling concern, or perhaps simply concern for appearances, for what the staff might whisper if she seemed too cruel. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to let me visit a private clinic alone, a clinic conveniently located just 2 streets from the cafe where Andres waited. Diego, eager as always to avoid any inconvenience that might interrupt his morning, backed my request immediately, entirely unaware that his careless approval was helping me slip through the one crack in their careful surveillance. I found Andres Ferro sitting alone in a quiet corner booth of the cafe, older than I remembered from childhood visits to my father's office, his hair now fully silver, his eyes sharp and alert behind thin wire glasses. When he saw me approaching, he rose immediately and gave a small, deeply respectful bow, the kind of gesture that instantly reminded me I was still, somewhere beneath all the humiliation, my father's daughter. "Thank you for coming, Elena," he said, his voice low, warm, achingly familiar. "Your father always suspected this day might come." I sat across from him and told him absolutely everything, my voice cracking at several points despite my best efforts to remain composed. The desperate promise I made in that hospital room, month after month of carefully orchestrated humiliation, the overheard phone call, the document I had photographed with trembling hands 2 nights earlier. He listened without a single flicker of visible surprise, his expression calm, almost knowing, and when I finally finished, he opened his own worn leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed folder, its edges soft from years of careful handling. "Your father wrote 2 wills," he said quietly, sliding the folder across the small table between us. The first, the one Renata knows about, the one she's built her entire plan around, simply leaves you the full estate outright. But there is a second clause, Elena, one that only I have ever known about, activated by one very specific condition. He slid a single page toward me. I read it once, then again slowly, forcing myself to fully absorb every carefully chosen word. It stated in precise legal language that if I, Elena Duarte, was ever forced or manipulated into signing any document renouncing my inheritance or transferring company assets to another party, the exact moment such a document was signed, a separate protective clause would automatically activate. Under that clause, all shares currently held by Renata Duarte in the company would transfer immediately and irrevocably into my name. I stared at the page until the words blurred, stunned into complete silence. My father hadn't simply tried to protect me from a distance. He had built an elegant, patient trap so perfectly constructed that Renata's own greed would eventually become the very rope she hanged herself with. He knew, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. He knew she would eventually force my hand. He counted on it, Andres said gently. The more desperately she reaches to take everything from you, Elena, the more completely she loses. Now our task becomes simple, though it will require perfect nerve on your part. We create a document that appears absolutely identical to the one she's prepared, the same paper stock, the same ink, the same binding, but the contents will state the precise opposite, that Renata voluntarily transfers her shares in Duarte Vineyards to you. Your mission, and I won't pretend it will be easy, is finding the exact moment to switch the documents before your fingerprint touches paper. He handed me the false real document, its weight heavier in my hands than paper had any right to feel. I studied every single line, every comma, every careful spacing of text until the entire page was burned permanently into my memory, until I could recite it perfectly in complete darkness. Keep this hidden somewhere no one would think to search, he instructed. The moment she finally makes her move, contact me immediately through this line. I will have our full legal team and private security ready to move the instant you signal us. I hid the document beneath a carefully cut false lining sewn into my suitcase, a hiding place I checked obsessively every single night. Every evening, while the house slept around me, I studied that document by the dim light of a borrowed phone until I could have recited it word for word, even half asleep. I understood with complete clarity that I would have exactly one chance. If I failed, I would lose everything, forever, and there would be no second opportunity waiting for me in the grass. While I waited for Renata to make her final move, I made myself smaller still, more convincingly foolish than ever before. I broke dishes deliberately, watching them shatter with a strange, detached calm. I burned rice on purpose, letting smoke fill the kitchen while Renata scolded me in front of the staff. I let my hands tremble more than ever, feeding her growing certainty that I was exactly the pitiful fool she had always believed me to be. She grew crueler with each passing week, emboldened by the confidence of a woman who genuinely believed she had already won completely. One particularly bitter afternoon, she threw a handful of spoiled, rotting vegetables at my feet and told me, quite calmly, that people like me deserved nothing better in this life. I knelt down and picked them up without a single word of complaint, my anger simmering silently beneath a carefully maintained mask of defeat, while inside, something cold and patient continued counting down the days. The tension inside that house continued climbing steadily. Renata began holding closed-door meetings with a man in an expensive dark suit who came and went from the property with unsettling regularity, always carrying a leather briefcase, always leaving her humming softly with satisfaction as she moved through the halls afterward. I knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent months studying every flicker of her expression, that the final move was drawing very close. It came on an otherwise ordinary Thursday morning, 3 full weeks after my secret meeting with Andres. Renata summoned Diego and me into the main living room, dressed in a deep red gown far too formal for a Thursday morning, her makeup done with unusual precision, looking every bit the queen she had always believed herself destined to become. She placed the false contract carefully on the polished glass table in front of me, her movements deliberate, ceremonial almost. "Elena," she said, her earlier sweetness completely gone now, replaced by something cold, direct, commanding, "it's time we finally finish this. You know you can't read well. You know your mind simply isn't built for business the way your father's was. He's gone now, and I'm doing this for your own good, to protect everything he spent his life building. Sign here. Give it all to me and Diego, and we will take care of everything from this point forward. You will want for absolutely nothing." I let my eyes widen with carefully practiced fear, my voice cracking exactly as it had 100 times before. I can't. It's my father's entire legacy. Please, Mama, don't make me do this. Don't make you, she snapped, her patience visibly thinning, cracks appearing in her composed facade for the first time in weeks. If you're so terribly capable, then run this entire company yourself. Do you even know how to properly read a financial report? Negotiate an international contract? Or would you rather stand by and watch everything your father built with his own 2 hands burn to ash in your clumsy, useless grip? Her words were designed to wound, meant to cut deep enough to finally break me, but they were also, at last, my signal. I glanced quickly toward the kitchen doorway. Consuelo stood there, dish rag clutched tightly in one hand, and for one brief electric second, our eyes met across the room. "I don't want to," I whispered again, letting my voice crack further, stalling desperately for the precious seconds I needed. Exactly on cue, Consuelo's voice tore through the house, sharp with practiced panic. "Fire! There's a fire in the kitchen!" Thin gray smoke immediately curled from the kitchen doorway, rising from dry leaves she had carefully burned in an old iron pot hidden behind the counter. Renata and Diego both shot up from their seats simultaneously and rushed toward the smoke, genuine alarm flashing across their faces. 3 seconds of complete chaos. 3 seconds of pure gold. I moved faster than I had moved in 2 entire years of careful, deliberate stillness. I pulled the true document from where I had hidden it against my own body beneath my loose blouse and slid Renata's false contract silently into my sleeve in one fluid, practiced motion. The switch happened in an instant, seamless, invisible, exactly as I had rehearsed it 1,000 times alone in my room at night. When they returned moments later, certain the small fire had rattled my already fragile nerves into complete submission, I sat perfectly calm, the correct document resting quietly in my lap, my face still convincingly wet with genuine tears of accumulated stress. "Just a burnt rag," Consuelo announced breathlessly, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's completely out now, Señora." Renata shot her a sharp, suspicious glare, then turned back to me, mistaking my sudden stillness for total surrender. "Enough playing pretend, Elena. Are you going to sign this or not? Or should I finally call a doctor to formally declare you mentally unfit and have you committed somewhere more appropriate?" That final threat was the last nail. I understood, with perfect clarity, that it was time to end this performance forever. I picked up the pen with carefully practiced, trembling fingers, and shook my head slowly. "I don't know how to sign properly, Mama. You know that." Renata smiled, deeply satisfied, victory already gleaming in her eyes. "Then use your fingerprint." She nodded sharply at Diego, who produced a small pad of deep red ink from his jacket pocket without a single word of protest. I looked at that ink, at their eager, hungry, greedy faces leaning forward in anticipation, and felt something inside my chest settle into a perfect icy calm I had never experienced before in my entire life. I pressed my finger firmly into the ink and slowly, deliberately, brought it toward the paper resting in my lap, toward the true document, the one with my father's elegant trap folded quietly inside it. I pressed my fingerprint firmly onto the line marked recipient of transferred shares. It was done. Renata snatched the paper immediately from my lap, admiring the stark red mark like a hunter admiring a trophy. "Finally," she breathed. "It's finally over." She turned to Diego, patted his shoulder proudly, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across her face. "We've done it. Everything starts now, my son. Everything." I rose slowly from my seat.
Something in my posture, some subtle shift in my bearing, must have unsettled her deeply, because her wide smile faltered slightly at the edges. "Thank you," I said, my voice suddenly clear, steady, without a single trace of the stammer I had performed for 6 long months.
Thank you for signing the transfer of every one of your shares in Duarte Vineyards into my name. The room fell into absolute, ringing silence. Renata blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across her features. What are you talking about? What transfer?
"Read it again," I said calmly, my voice as steady as stone.
Carefully this time.
She unfolded the paper with visibly shaking hands, her eyes scanning frantically line by line, and I watched the color drain completely from her face as she reached the document's true title.
This isn't what she looked up at me, her eyes wide with dawning, absolute horror. You switched it. When?
How? During the fire, I said quietly.
The very fire your own cruelty gave me the perfect cover to create. She let out a scream of pure, unfiltered fury and lunged suddenly for a small kitchen knife left carelessly on the side table from breakfast. Before she could reach me, the front door burst open and Andres Ferro walked in with calm, commanding authority, flanked by 2 uniformed security officers and a young legal associate holding a tablet steady in his hands. "That's quite enough, Señora Renata," Andres said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Any further act of violence from this point forward will be recorded and used directly against you in a court of law. On the tablet screen played footage from a hidden camera Andres had quietly installed weeks earlier without anyone's knowledge. Renata presenting the fake contract with cold calculation, her voice on a recorded phone call discussing my supposed stupidity, and finally, her own triumphant face captured clearly as she watched me press my fingerprint onto what she genuinely believed was her ultimate victory. "This is a conspiracy," she hissed, spinning around wildly to stare at every face in the room like a cornered, wounded animal.
"No," Andres replied evenly, his voice carrying the calm weight of absolute certainty.
"This is simply the execution of your late husband's final will. He anticipated this exact moment years ago and gave his daughter every tool she needed to protect herself." The police arrived within the hour, their sirens cutting sharply through the quiet afternoon. Renata was formally charged with coercion and attempted assault. The fabricated inheritance document itself became damning evidence of fraud so complete that even her own frantically summoned lawyer couldn't argue meaningfully around it. As cold handcuffs closed firmly around her wrists, she turned to look at me one final, lingering time, and in her eyes I saw not anger anymore, but the hollow, bottomless disbelief of someone who had finally, completely understood she had lost absolutely everything to the very fool she herself had so carefully created. Diego collapsed onto the sofa, his entire body shaking violently, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him in real, devastating time. When the officers finally led his mother away through the front door, he crawled desperately toward me across the floor, grabbing weakly at the hem of my dress. "Elena, please. I didn't know it would go this far, I swear it. She forced me into all of this.
You know exactly how she is."
I looked down at him without a single trace of pity remaining in my heart. "You're a grown man, Diego. You chose silence every single time they humiliated me in front of guests, in front of staff, in front of complete strangers. You chose comfort and convenience over conscience, again and again. Don't you dare blame your mother now for choices that were always entirely your own."
"We're still married," he pleaded, desperate now, his voice cracking.
"I can help you run the company properly. I'll never listen to her again, not ever, only you. We can start over completely, Elena, please." I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it all. Our marriage ended the exact day you watched them mock me relentlessly and said absolutely nothing to stop it. You have 24 hours to pack your belongings and leave this house permanently.
"It belongs to me now, entirely, by my father's true and final will," he begged. He wept openly on the floor, but I turned and walked calmly away, because I had already given him far more mercy than that house had ever once given me in 2 long years. Winning back the house, I quickly discovered, was only half the battle still ahead of me.
The company itself remained riddled with people Renata had carefully planted over many years, loyal entirely to her money, openly hostile toward a young woman they wrongly assumed had crawled out of genuine ignorance into a title she clearly didn't deserve. My very first board meeting as majority shareholder was met with barely concealed contempt from nearly every director seated around that long mahogany table. One senior director in particular, a sharp-eyed man named Ibarra who owed his entire career position to Renata's quiet influence over the years, spoke first, his tone dripping with false, condescending respect. With all due respect, Señorita Duarte, ideas alone are simply not enough to run an empire of this size and complexity. Perhaps it would be far wiser for you to step back gracefully and let the experienced board handle major decisions while you familiarize yourself slowly with how the business actually operates. Several other directors nodded along in silent agreement, clearly ready to reduce me permanently to nothing more than a decorative signature on paperwork they fully intended to control themselves. I said absolutely nothing in response. I simply opened my laptop with steady hands, connected it calmly to the boardroom projector, and let the numbers speak far louder than any words of mine ever could. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly, my voice perfectly level. "We should talk about numbers, then. Here is last quarter's complete financial report." I highlighted a glaring discrepancy of nearly €2 million in marketing expenses that didn't match any actual campaign performance anywhere in our records. "Mr. Ibarra, perhaps you can kindly explain to this entire board where exactly this money went. Or perhaps I should explain instead that it appears to have been carefully routed through a shell company registered under your own wife's maiden name." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. His face went completely pale as I continued methodically, laying out contract after contract signed directly against the company's clear interests, incompetent hires placed deliberately in critical roles, entire projects delayed intentionally to slowly bleed the business dry over years. 2 full years of quiet, patient study, of watching everything unfold while pretending to understand nothing at all, had taught me exactly where every single piece of rot had spread throughout this company. "Starting today," I announced, closing my laptop with quiet finality, "an independent audit committee will thoroughly review every financial and personnel decision made across the last 5 years. Anyone found to have deliberately damaged this company's interests will answer fully for it, regardless of their current position or seniority. Anyone who no longer feels genuinely aligned with a culture of complete honesty is welcome to submit their resignation within the next 24 hours. Within a single week, Ibarra and 3 of his closest allies quietly resigned in unison, each citing vague health reasons. Their sudden departure acted like powerful medicine on a badly infected wound. New leadership rose swiftly in their place, talented people who had been repeatedly overlooked for years simply because they refused to play dirty political games. Within just a few months, Duarte Vineyards wasn't merely recovering from years of quiet sabotage, it was actively thriving, expanding confidently into entirely new markets, restoring the trust of nervous investors who had quietly worried the company might slowly die alongside its founder. Months later, I visited Renata once, in the sterile visiting room of the prison where she now served her lengthy sentence. She looked noticeably smaller behind the reinforced glass, her once elegant hair streaked heavily with new gray, her sharp eyes dulled significantly by genuine fear and the slow passage of time. When she saw me approach, she didn't scream or curse at me the way I had almost expected. She simply stared, silent, hollow. "I'm not here to gloat," I told her honestly through the worn phone receiver mounted on the wall between us. "I spoke with the lawyers this morning. I'm not pursuing any further claims against what little remains of your personal assets. When you're eventually released, there will be enough left for you and Diego to live modestly, without hunger or hardship." "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse, cracked from disuse. "After absolutely everything I did to destroy you?" "Because I refuse to become you," I said simply. "Revenge without any limits doesn't actually bring real peace, Renata. It just creates a second monster where only one used to stand alone." I paused, letting my next words settle fully between us. You lost the only thing you truly ever wanted in this life. Not the house. Not the money. Respect. And that is a sentence far longer than any prison term could ever be. I stood, gently hung up the phone, and walked out of that visiting room without once looking back over my shoulder. These days, I run Duarte Vineyards from the very same office my father once used himself, its walls still lined with black and white photographs of the man who patiently taught me that quiet patience can be sharper than any blade ever forged. I established a scholarship fund in his honored name for young people who genuinely cannot afford a proper education, the exact kind of quiet chance he once gave me in secret, hidden carefully behind 2 long years of pretending I understood absolutely nothing at all. Consuelo still lives comfortably in the house today, cared for like true family, because that is precisely what she became to me through it all. Andres remains my closest and most trusted advisor, the last living piece of my father's enduring wisdom still walking this earth alongside me. Some quiet evenings, I visit my father's grave and sit beside the cool marble stone, telling him everything that has happened since, the company's steady growth, the justice finally and completely served, the difficult promise I somehow kept even when I didn't fully understand why he had asked it of me in the first place. I like to believe he already knows every detail. I like to believe he watched every single second of it unfold from somewhere far beyond my reach, patient until the very end, just like the elegant, quiet plan he had so carefully built for me alone. They genuinely believed a fool would never notice the trap slowly closing around her own neck. They never once imagined that the exact same fingerprint they demanded in order to destroy me completely would become the very mark that handed me everything they had ever owned in this world. And that, more than any fortune, more than any title, more than any empire of vineyards stretching endlessly toward the horizon, is the deepest truth I carry with me still, every single day. The quietest person sitting in the room is sometimes the only one who was ever truly paying attention all along.